Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to York Engineering's continuing series of webinars. So this afternoon, we'll be talking about numeric action level exceedances under the stormwater industrial general permit and the level 2 exceedance response action process. We'll talk quickly about numeric action levels, then we'll talk in detail about the level 2 process itself. And if we have time at the end of the presentation, we'll entertain some questions. This webinar often runs a little long. If we don't get to your question, we will definitely record it and send you an email follow-up if we don't get to it during the hour-long webinar. A quick bit about York Engineering. It was founded 20 years ago by Judy York. Worked for over 700 customers at 1,000 facilities. Completed over 5,000 air, water, and waste projects. And we've been pretty active in stormwater over the past number of years, worked for over 200 companies on stormwater projects. Your presenters today are myself, Jeff Knight. I'm a principal scientist here at York. Also assisting me is Jeremy Howes, who is our IT manager. He's going to give you a couple of tips on using the GoToWebinar software.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. If you're coming back from this morning's webinar, thanks for coming back and joining us again. We do have everybody muted, so if you do have a question at any time, please use the GoToWebinar window there. You can expand it and collapse it with the orange arrow, and then you can ask your question. We'll try to get to the, sometimes we're able to answer the questions during the webinar, but most times we actually answer at the end if we have time. Otherwise, like Jeff said, we'll follow up with an email or phone call. No polls in this webinar today, so feel free to ask any questions anytime you want. I do want to mention one question that we always get. Can we get a copy of the slides? And the answer is yes. We'll get you a copy of the slides probably this afternoon or tomorrow afternoon at the latest. So there you go. Jeff, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. All right. So as most of you probably know, the 2015 IGP established some new processes for ensuring that every permittee under the permit meets what's called best practicable control technology currently available. We shorten that to BPT. This is a Clean Water Act standard that is required to be in NPDES permits for stormwater for all the states. So California is not unique in the way, in the requirement to ensure that permittees implement BPT. California, however, has chosen to do it a certain way, and in California we're using this concept of specified action levels, numeric action levels, NALs. For dischargers who exceed those NALs, they must apply a series of specific actions to ensure that they fully apply the concept of BPT. So these actions you take are required under the terms of the Clean Water Act as implemented by the state writing the permit. So as people probably already know, everyone samples in California for pH, TSS, total suspended solids, and oil and grease, O&G. Other parameters you may be required to also sample for based on your facility's SIC code. So specified SIC codes must add some additional parameters, metals most often. There also is a good possibility that if you are discharging to an impaired water body, you will be asked to analyze for additional parameters based on whether those impairments are associated with activities at your facility. And you evaluate this mainly through the SMARTS impaired water bodies tool that everybody should have gone through as part of their getting their facilities set up in SMARTS. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, go ahead and shoot me an email and I'll give you an update on what that is. But everybody should have gone through this impaired water body evaluation for your facility. Finally, just to note that there is a new concept which you'll start to hear about when the industrial permit gets updated. That process is going on right now. The comments were taken on the draft permit. I think that comment period ended in February. And the new concept is also related to water body impairments. And this is going to add a whole new group of numeric action levels that are called TNALs. That are related to TMDLs for various water bodies, which are going to have TMDL set. And these will be additional NALs that if your facility has the potential to discharge these impairment parameters, you're going to have to follow a similar process for these impairment parameters. So the concept of the level 1 and level 2 that we're talking about here in the webinars today is only going to expand under the concept of the California draft permit. So what does level 2 mean? Essentially means that you have 2 or more years of failing to meet the numeric action levels. If you fail to meet 1 or more numeric action levels, after 1 year, you're elevated to level 1. And then if a second second consecutive year, you fail to meet the NALs, you are elevated to level 2. Now, it's important to remember that both in level 1 and in level 2, at no time is exceeding a numeric action level actually in itself a permit violation. You're only in violation of the permit if you fail to take the actions required by the level 1 and level 2 processes as specified in the IGP. It also may be of some comfort to know that the state fully expects that many dischargers will enter level 2 and never leave it. They will never be able to achieve the NALs, at least within the defined permit term for the IGP, which is to 2020. So there are certainly situations where people just simply cannot, despite best efforts, achieve the NALs. And it's entirely consistent with the Clean Water Act to implement these BPT concepts, but still not meet the NALs. However, it's going to be a much easier process, of course, if you do develop BMPs that allow you to meet the NALs and return to what's known as baseline status, where you are fully below all of the numeric action levels. Page 45 in the permit fact sheet is a flow chart that describes the entering and exiting of level 2, although it doesn't really talk about exiting back to baseline exactly, but it shows how you enter level 1 and subsequently may enter level 2, and again emphasizing that you're only in violation of the permit if you fail to execute any of the actions under level 1 or level 2, or fail, of course, to fully implement your SWIP. Now, the status of level 1 or level 2 is by parameter. So it's very possible, and we have a number of dischargers that we're working with that are simultaneously in baseline for some parameters, in level 1 for other parameters, and in level 2 for other parameters. So, for example, a facility could be in level 2 for total suspended solids by having had 2 consecutive years where they're exceeding the NAL. They may be at level 1, for example, for pH, because although pH was in compliance in the previous 2 years ago sampling year, in the current sampling year, you've now exceeded the instantaneous NAL for pH. Now you're going to be in level 1 for that parameter. And it's possible to be in baseline status for example, for zinc in this case, after you implement level 1 ERAs successfully, lower your future stormwater sampling results below the zinc NAL. Now, it's important to note that if you return to baseline from level 2, so this level 2 process we're talking about, if you follow all the actions, you implement additional best management practices, achieve the NALs in, for example, next year, but then in subsequent years, you again exceed the NALs, you're immediately returned to level 2 status. You do not, you go directly from baseline to level 2. You never go through level 1 for a parameter more than once. This concept is not illustrated on the IGP fact sheet we just showed, but it is stated in the IGP. So you only enter level 1 once for any given parameter. Okay, the key level 2 ERA deadlines are January 1st is the key deadline for all actions under level 2. By January 1st, you must submit your level 2 action plan. And so if you enter level 2 on July 1 of this year, meaning you're in your second year of exceeding the NALs, by the following January 1st, 2019, you'll be responsible for submitting into SMARTS your level 2 action plan. 1 year later, after having executed your level 2 action plan, you'll be required to submit a level 2 technical report that describes the outcome of all the actions that you took during level 2 and the BMPs that you implement. Now, for this level 2 technical report, there's actually an automatic 6-month extension that is granted as long as you submit an explanation. So it's not a discretionary action by the board. If you request the extension out to 18 months after January 1st of 2019, you will be granted it. You can get further technical report extensions, but you have to specifically petition the regional board and they agree to it. This long cycle during level 2, this 1 year of implementing the actions, an automatic 6-month extension, and then further extensions possible, really illustrates the complexity of level 2. There's a lot of work, especially if you're going to implement some more of the complex best management practices at your site, for example, stormwater treatment. The state board understands that can be a long cycle of evaluation, design, capital budgeting, construction, and implementation in these level 2 actions. So that is recognized, but there are deadlines built into the IGP. So in contrast to level 1, where the exceedance response actions are really focused on addressing operational deficiencies, in other words, the things people do at a site, whether they be house cleaning or properly handling materials or training your stormwater staff, the assumption is if you enter level 2 that those operational deficiencies have all been corrected, and now you're going to have to start working with advanced BMPs. Advanced BMPs being either isolating your pollutant source by bringing them indoors or covering them, detaining or retaining your stormwater in order to avoid actually discharging stormwater, or treating the stormwater prior to discharge. These are the 3 types of advanced BMPs described in the IGP. It's important to remember, however, that no matter how much how many advanced BMPs or the complexity of the advanced BMPs you may end up installing level 2, failure to execute the minimum BMPs as described in the IGP or as described in your SWIP remains a permit violation. So no matter how extensive your stormwater treatment may be, you're still held responsible for implementing the minimum BMPs at your facility. So just keep that in mind as you go through level 2, even if advanced BMPs are put into place. Just a couple of quick examples here. If you see any of these types of conditions at your facility, the photo on the left suggesting there may be some unauthorized non-stormwater discharges from the, looks like in this case, from the solid waste bins over there, going to a storm drain. If you have material spills, inadequate material handling as shown in the center photograph, or inadequate waste material handling as shown in the third photograph, all these remain violations of the violations of the IGP, because you are not implementing the minimum BMPs required by the IGP, even if in each case here there was stormwater treatment downstream of those stormwater collection devices. You still are held to those minimum requirements. So as I mentioned, the 3 classes of advanced best management practices are: number 1, exposure minimization. And these are any type of BMP which serves to uh, minimize the exposure of any type of industrial material, industrial wastes, or industrial activities. They can be permanent, building a roof, building a building, or they can be temporary. They can be designed to be put up when it rains or taken down or in other situations. But any measures that prevent contact of stormwater with identified materials or activity are considered to be exposure minimization. Obviously, in many situations, these are the most effective advanced BMPs. If stormwater never contacts the industrial materials or activities, presumably there is no chance that you could exceed the numeric action levels. Stormwater containment or discharge reduction best management practices are the second type of advanced BMPs, and these are BMPs, typically physical structures, that serve to either divert stormwater, infiltrate it into the ground, reuse it, somehow contain it, and prevent it, either prevent it or reduce the amount of stormwater that is discharged. Interestingly, this is the strong preference being built into the draft industrial permit that is really going to encourage stormwater containment and discharge reduction as a strategy for addressing the TMDLs, the inherent water body impairments that I discussed previously. This is all being built into the new permit, and you'll have some relief granted if you choose to adopt certain types of stormwater containment and discharge reduction. Finally, there are treatment control BMPs. When you are not able to either shelter your materials and activities or detain or retain your stormwater runoff, you may have to treat your stormwater discharge before it is discharged. This is obviously somewhat of a brute force method, but there are many, many technologies out there that are doing just that in treating stormwater as it exits industrial sites. So the first task you'll face when entering level 2 is develop your level 2 action plan. And essentially what your action plan is a strategy, including a schedule, to determine the sources of your exceedances, of the NAL exceedances, and what you propose to do about them. Level 2, in contrast with level 1, recognizes that the sources of NAL exceedances can be from really three main sources. Of course, your industrial activities themselves may be the cause of exceeding an NAL. There also may be NALs that are produced by NAL exceedances that are produced by non-industrial activities. Non-industrial activities can be either activities that occur on your site, for example, an employee parking lot or a metal roof. Neither of those situations are an industrial activity. They have nothing to do with your manufacturing activity as defined in your SIC code, and they may be contributing to your NAL exceedances. Similarly, other non-industrial activities include run-on to your site. So if your neighbor is running contaminated stormwater onto your site and that's producing your NAL exceedances, or if other sources within your urban area are contaminating the air, for example, and that air is and the metals, et cetera, in the air are being rained out and deposited onto your site or onto the ground surfaces at your site by a dry deposition, and then are subsequently washed into stormwater and are causing your NAL exceedances. Those will also be considered non-industrial activities. The third category that the IGP recognizes is naturally occurring background sources. We have seen very few sites which we believe may be impacted by naturally occurring background sources, but it is a possibility for sites that are out in rural areas that have large areas of unpaved soil, either on site or have run on from areas that might have naturally high concentration of stormwater parameters. Iron from iron-rich soils, arsenic can be a problem in some areas of the southeast deserts where there's just simply naturally occurring metals that may impact your stormwater results. So what level 2 process requires is that you make a formal declaration that if you believe that non-industrial activities or background sources are producing your NAL exceedances, you must formally declare that that's what you believe, and then you must demonstrate that theory with data. So unfortunately, the IGP doesn't allow you to simply wave your arms and say, point at your neighbor or point at the soil off-site. You have to collect data and demonstrate that this is actually the case and that these contributions are causing your NAL exceedances. We've created a little flow chart here, which is somewhat complex, but again illustrates what I've talked about. Once you're elevated to level 2, you're going to make a basic determination, or at least create a basic theory of whether your industrial activities are or are not the cause of your NAL exceedances. If you believe they are the cause, your industrial activities, then you're going to move to the left on the chart, and you're going to develop an action plan, basically to say how I'm going to screen and design advanced BMPs that will address the industrial sources, and then you would proceed as part of the second, level 2 implementation. You'd be implementing these advanced BMPs, and then at the end of that process, you would write a technical report that would evaluate how well your advanced BMPs controlled your industrial pollutants. If you, however, believe that the industrial sources are not the cause, but rather there's a non-industrial, an NI or a B, a background source, you're going to develop an action plan to evaluate the contribution of these non-industrial or background sources. So you're going to move to the right in the chart. You're going to collect data, and then you're going to reach another decision point where you're going to say, is it or is it not the case that the non-industrial or background sources are the cause of my NAL exceedances? If you believe they are the cause, then you're going to write a technical report which describes your data collection, and the conclusions you reach based on the data that the naturally occurring background or the non-industrial sources are indeed the cause of your NAL exceedances. Now, if you go through the right side of the flow chart, collect data, and then are not able to demonstrate that the non-industrial background sources are the causes of the exceedance, what then? Unfortunately, the IGP is silent on this. It doesn't really consider this path. The only real logical conclusion is that you're going to have to go back to the left side of the flowchart, because if you've demonstrated that it is not a non-industrial or background sources, then it must be your industrial sources, and you need to move to the left to develop an action plan and develop your advanced BMP. So not adequate, not really described in the IGP, but the assumption is this is what you're going to have to do. The problem is that if you go down the right side of that flowchart and spend a year demonstrating or trying to demonstrate, collecting data and et cetera, that the non-industrial background sources are the cause of your NAL exceedances, and then you find out that they're not, you're in a bit of a bind, because now you've spent a long time on a non-productive evaluation, and to meet the approximately 2 years to complete this process, you're going to be in a real hurry-up mode to race through developing an action plan and implementing it to address those industrial sources. It's a key to remember that the level 2 process is not just deciding what advanced BMPs you're going to implement, but you must, in both the action plan and in the implementation, address selecting the technology, screening the technology, selecting the technology, designing it, constructing it, and operating it. Okay? This is all supposed to be done in this approximately 2-year level 2 process. So again, you really start to run yourself out of time if you go down a path of trying to, for example, blame it on a neighbor, and you can't demonstrate that with data. You're going to be in a real hurry-up mode to complete the other side of the level 2 process. Again, your industrial BMP demonstration includes installation. Okay, so the implementation phase is a very difficult and often capital intensive. You may have problems or you may have challenges to getting the capital resources needed. Many people's budgeting cycles last a year or more, and if you have to put in, for example, a expensive stormwater treatment system, this really stretches out the timeline for you to meet the level 2 requirements. Okay, so let's say that you are admitting, or at least your theory is, yes, it's my industrial sources that are causing my NAL exceedances. What do you need to do? Essentially, your what they call the industrial activity BMP demonstration is essentially saying, this is how I am going to select, implement advanced BMPs to address my NAL exceedances. You are going to focus on the specific drainage areas for which the exceedances are occurring. This is somewhat in contrast to the level 1 process, where the level 1 process really says you need to revise your SWIP and address BMPs across your entire site, although there may be some places where you perform certain BMPs and certain where you don't. You address the site as a whole in level 1. Level 2 recognizes that if your causes of the NAL exceedances are specific to a specific part of your site, you're allowed to address your advanced BMPs directly to those sources or to those source areas. Other than that, it's very wide open. In level 2, you're allowed to propose, implement, and do anything that you believe will work for the facility as long as the entire design and implementation process follows the IGP. For example, there are specific design parameters if you are implementing stormwater treatment that must be followed. You must use not only use a California PE, but you must also meet specific volume or flow-based design standards to ensure that when you put a treatment system in, you will be actually treating the stormwater that discharges from the site under most conditions. Now, the IGP does allow for the possibility that even with advanced BMPs, you're not going to meet NALs. Either the technology, the best practicable control technology, has not advanced to the point where you can actually meet the NALs for your particular situation, or there's some reason of feasibility that you cannot install a technology that would meet the NALs. So it isn't exactly the end of the road. There is a possibility fully recognized in the IGP that you may not meet the NALs, and this is one of the reasons that the state expects many facilities to get into level 2 status and never leave for the duration of the permit. Okay, so you've written your level 2 action plan, and then approximately a year later or longer, if you've gotten one of the extensions, you will be required to submit your level 2 technical report. Your level 2 technical report is relatively straightforward. You're essentially saying, this is the selection process I went through. These are the advanced BMPs that I selected. These are how I implemented it. And these are how effective they were. And the concept here is that you are going to use your normal stormwater sampling routine that's defined in your monitoring implementation plan to collect samples that will hopefully demonstrate that these advanced BMPs allow you to achieve the numeric action levels. All this is supposed to take place in this 12 to 18 month period after you submit your level 2 technical report, your level 2 action plan on January 1st of 2019. So you have until, if you go into level 2 this year, you have until either January 2020 or if you get the 6-month extension, July 2020, to have completed this process. And just reemphasizing that, from July 1st to January 1, in this case of 2019, if you're just entering level 2 on July 1st of this year, you have 6 months to plan the work. You'll submit that level 2 action plan by January 1st that says what I'm going to do for the next year to year and a half. Then from January 1st to January 1st, unless you get the automatic extension, you do the work and finish it off. So the sum total is that unless you're granted a specific extension, you have a total of 2 years to complete your level 2 activities, starting from, again, July 1st this year, when you presumably may enter level 2 status. So now, again, this is parameter by parameter. It's not until you actually enter level 2 for a specific parameter that you have to perform all these exceedance response actions. But of course, if you're already in level 2 for parameter A, and then the next year you enter level 2 for parameter B, you're going to have to start the entire process over again for that parameter. There's also a provision in the IGP for updating your technical report. So you can submit your initial technical report, and if your technical report stated that you believed that the advanced BMPs would continue to meet the NALs, but you find out that you don't, then you're going to be required to update your technical report and basically explain why. Because you selected the technology that you thought would do the job, and if it turns out not to do the job, you're going to be required to state why, state what you're going to do about it. Are you going to change the way you operate the BMP? Are you going to select a new BMP? There's an expectation that you're going to continue to hunt for and implement a solution to achieving the NALs. There is also a requirement in the IGP that specifies you'll update your technical report when you have changes in your operations, pollutant sources appear or disappear, or other factors change. This is a statement in the IGP. It's not clear exactly how this is linked to NAL exceedances, but there's and we hope at some point the state board will clarify why you would update your technical report for reasons not associated with the NAL exceedances. If you do not have to update your technical report, you simply indicate that as part of your annual report. And of course, none of the work that you do at level 1 or level 2 changes at all the basic compliance responsibilities of a discharger in the IGP. You have to maintain and implement your SWIP, and you have to collect samples and submit them into SMARTS, and you have to perform your annual reporting function, which I assume everybody knows is coming up here for this year. Your annual reports are, again, like every other year, due into SMARTS by July 15th. So what are the challenges to the industrial BMP demonstration? And again, perform an industrial BMP demonstration when it's your belief that your industrial activities are the source of your NAL exceedances. Of course, there are, as anybody who's in this business probably knows, there are all kinds of new and emerging technologies that will claim to address your stormwater problems. Lots of vendors out there with lots of different solutions, lots of different equipment, and all kinds of claims. The problem, of course, is sorting through these various vendors and technologies and trying to figure out, do they work? Are they proven to work? Have there been any studies on them? Can they show you examples? Can you talk to customers who have them installed them? Do they have reps and certs, representations and certifications where they have performance guarantees? How do you know when you select a technology or when you're looking at competing technologies what is actually going to work and what the vendor is going to stand behind? Of course, as we mentioned, another major challenge is the level 2 schedule itself. You may have a facility budgeting cycle that for capital investment that may not support installation of a $200,000 stormwater treatment system, in the next year. It may be something that has to be planned years in advance, and if that's the case, you're going to need to describe that in your action plan and have it clearly laid out so that it can be shown, demonstrated to the regional board that you are in the process of doing this. Of course, evaluating capital versus O&M costs can also be difficult. Many of these technologies require extensive operations and maintenance. Even treatment technologies that are nominally passive, that don't involve pumps and this kind of thing, still require maintenance. Even the simplest advanced BMPs, such as putting down filter socks or stormwater straw wattle, require maintenance. You have to pick up those filters and wattle and clean out the sediments, or they're going to be overwhelmed and no longer work. So they're evaluating both the capital costs and the long-term operational costs for the different technologies out there can be a challenge if you don't have people who are experienced with this sort of technology comparison. Strategies that we often use in industrial BMP demonstrations, however, are to really look at whether operational BMPs can be used in conjunction with low-tech and low-cost advanced BMPs. Of course, you're supposed to have solved all your operational BMPs, operational issues in level 1. The reality is we're finding that's frequently not the case, that people try to commit to doing a better job or commit to new BMPs during level 1, but don't quite get there and then get elevated to level 2 and say, gee, I have to get serious about my operational BMPs. You're supposedly under the IGP past the point of operational improvements, but the fact is many people redouble their efforts at operational improvements during level 2 and are able to, in combination with some relatively low-tech or low-cost advanced BMPs, such as filters or straw wattles or detention, achieve NALs. So that is something you definitely want to still look critically at. Are you really implementing everything operationally as you said you would under level 1? Redouble efforts at looking at those in level 2. Of course, you also want to look at naturally occurring background and non-industrial sources. There's a specific process called out in the permit for non-industrial or background source determinations. Now, it's important to note that non-industrial and background sources that contribute to your NAL exceedances do not have to be the sole cause. So, for example, if you're exceeding the NAL for zinc, you're still maybe discharging zinc associated with your industrial activities. But if you can demonstrate that absent the non-industrial or background contributions, you would be below the NAL solely for your industrial discharges of zinc, then as long as you're able to demonstrate with data that it's these non-industrial background sources, you have demonstrated that that they are the predominant cause of the NAL exceedances. The good thing about finding the data to support that a non-industrial or background source is the predominant cause of your NAL exceedances is twofold. First of all, they allow you to forego advanced BMPs. In other words, the state is saying, we're not going to regulate you on non-industrial or background contributions. We are only allowed to regulate you on your industrial contributions to stormwater. So there's a major, that really is the major benefit of performing one of these demonstrations, is that you will not have to treat or detain or shelter your industrial activities to address the small amount of the parameter that's being discharged. The Problem, however, is that you cannot get out of level 2. Once you have made a non-industrial or background demonstration, you simply remain in level 2. You cannot go back to baseline status. And of course, the big advantage of baseline status is, in addition to just the potential bad publicity being a level 1 being a level 2 facility, is that you can't reduce the amount of sampling. So you will always be trapped into sampling 2 times each half year as you remain in level 2 status. You also have to continue to utilize your QUISP that you selected in level 1 or that you've reselected in level 2. You have to continue to have them involved in the program, and any document that you turn into SMARTS, you must indicate who your QUISP is. Now, if you're not continually doing updates to your technical reports, which would presumably be the case if you've demonstrated there's a non-industrial source, then you may not have much work for the QUISP to do. But again, you do not escape from level 2 by doing a non-industrial or background demonstration. Walk through these quickly, the components of a natural background source demonstration. This is, again, as I mentioned, probably an infrequent avenue for very many facilities. The definition of natural background means that the source cannot be related to human activity. So if you have run-on onto your site, it can't be run-on from an industrial source or from somewhere that has human disturbance. It really has to be, excuse me, it really has to be an area that is unimpacted by human activity, even historical human activity. You must also find a reference site that's demonstrated free of activity, and you essentially are going to compare the data from the reference site to your test site. In other words, you're essentially going to show that it is indeed the natural background metals in the soil or other parameters in the soil that are the cause of your exceedances. Now again, this may be an off-site source if you have run-on, or it may be an on-site source where you can, if you have, for example, large unpaved areas on your facility, mining facilities or some other types of facilities in large rural areas often have this type of situation. But again, you have to be able to demonstrate clearly demonstrate that an unimpacted soils are what is causing the background source impacts on your stormwater discharge. There's a lot of challenges to this. Obviously, you can't just show that there's arsenic in the soil in my area. You have to show that the arsenic is actually entering the stormwater at your site and is causing the NAL exceedances. So it's not just a matter of sampling the soil, it's showing the conceptual model that it gets into your stormwater and is the predominant cause of the NAL exceedances. You have to identify and sample in this off-site reference source if your source of contaminants is of background contamination is on site. Finding areas that lack any historical influence can be difficult. Clearly the background source demonstrations are really only relevant for a small group of metal, iron, arsenic. We've seen an aluminum site. But this is generally, this is going to be a very limited group of sites that are able to go down this path. Now, non-industrial source demonstrations, on the other hand, are fairly broad. There are a large number of activities that could be non-industrial sources that are the predominant cause of your NAL exceedances. The fact is, though, if you're going to enter into level 2, assuming that you're going to perform a non-industrial source demonstration, you should have a very good idea of not only the industrial sources that you do have that are contributing. You really have to know how your industrial sources are contributing, but you really have to have a good theory of what non-industrial sources are present that you're going to try to go defend with data collection. Now, it's likely often that there are multiple sources But this is not a very good time to go into sort of a shotgun approach and trying to sample every possible combination of non-industrial sources, searching for the magic bullet that will show that it's not my industrial activities. If you don't have a reasonable theory already at the beginning of level 2, you may not be well served by going through this. Essentially, the IGP says that there's 3 sources of non-industrial contributions: runoff from adjacent properties, aerial deposition, and non-industrial sources that are located on site. This, as you might imagine, can become complex because any of these 3 sources, possibilities, can be divided into multiple sources. We often recommend that you develop some kind of a conceptual site model for your sources of non-industrial activity that may be contributing. So conceptual site model looks at all the possible contributions from industrial activities, from non-industrial activities, from adjacent sources, for example, wet and dry deposition from the urban air, and of course ambient background sources. So you really want to lay these out, because in order to clearly demonstrate what the cause of the NAL exceedances are, you're going to have to sample each one of these sources that are potentially contributing and try to determine what their percentage, essentially, contribution is to your NAL exceedances. The very likely steps you're going to want to take, and again, this needs to be laid out in your action plan, because your action plan is going to state what you're going to do to perform your non-industrial source demonstration during the implementation phase, going from 2019 into through all of 2019. You're going to have to lay out the process. You're going to develop your conceptual site model. You're clearly going to have to develop a sampling plan in order to figure out what you're going to sample and where. You have to execute the work, your data evaluation, all the conclusions, and then writing your technical report. These are all things that need to be laid out in your action plan and thought through before you launch into your non-industrial source demonstration. There's a lot of challenges to this, to the non-industrial source demonstrations. Certainly, there are many situations, or at least a reasonable number of situations, where non-industrial sources are the predominant contributing factor to people's NAL exceedances. Especially in urban areas, there are a lot of sources of particularly metals out there that could very reasonably be the source of your impacts. The problem is, when you get into an urban area, there's a lot of potential sources, both industrial and non-industrial. If this is a relatively complex process, if you don't have experience with environmental sampling plans, statistical analysis, and this sort of thing, it may prove to be quite a challenge. And of course, if the demonstration doesn't pan out, in other words, if you collect a mass of data and then are not able to show that it is indeed the industrial source, indeed the non-industrial source that is causing the NAL exceedances, you're back to square one. So there is a feeling in a lot of situations that while you may go down the road of looking at the non-industrial sources, it is often prudent to also go down a parallel path and say, even if you don't put it into your action plan, to start to look at some of the technologies and et cetera, in case that you do have to implement advanced BMP. In other words, if you cannot prove that it is non-industrial sources, you're back to square one on your having to select and implement advanced BMPs. So some final thoughts here. Although there are 3 pathways, for level 2, doing your industrial activity demonstrations, your industrial BMP demonstration, and the non-industrial and the background demonstrations, those non-industrial and background demonstrations will probably be complex, and there's no guarantee. Although it's reasonable to be suspicious of a non-industrial source coming from a neighbor or falling out of the sky or being tracked on from the streets around you onto your facility, you're going to have to prove it if you're going to substantiate not having to go down the path of advanced BMPs. And if you're not able to do it, you're going to be right back at square one. So as I said, it may be wise to begin that process early. Even if you don't explicitly state this in your action plan, you want to start thinking about the potential of advanced BMPs unless it's obvious, patently obvious, that you have a non-industrial source that is the major contributor. Remember, too, that although you continue to have NAL exceedances based on the average of all the discharge locations at your site for the entire sampling year, because that's the way that we compare our stormwater sampling data to the established NALs. Level 2 actions should really focus on the drainage areas that are clearly causing the exceedances. And the IGP specifically recognizes that, for example, if we have 3 different discharge locations, but only one is really causing the problem, there's no reason to, for example, treat or detain stormwater from the 2 non-material discharge locations. So it's really, you want to focus, using your stormwater sampling data, really focus on where the problems are, and assume that if you solve that, the average concentration, since most of the time we're dealing with annual average NAL exceedances, assume that the getting that one bad spot down will bring you back into compliance. Of course, if you have multiple sources and multiple discharge locations that are contributing to your exceedances, well, then you may be implementing advanced BMPs in multiple locations at the site. It's also worth noting that the IGP hasn't really, didn't really treat what happens when facilities stay in level 2 over the long term. In other words, they are not able to get back to baseline and they continue to exceed NALs, or they continue to exceed NALs even though they demonstrated that there's a non-industrial background source. The permit cycle for the 2015 permit is to 2020, and it really didn't look into the future. When our conversations with the state board are that, well, these types of things will be figured out in the future permit cycle. The current draft permit, again, makes no mention of these concepts, even though it is being amended for the imposition of the TMDL and the TNALs. There really hasn't been any clarity. So we're hoping eventually the regional board is going to issue guidance on this long-term level 2 status for some facilities. Okay, contact information is provided here. If you have questions on level 2 or any stormwater issue, feel free to contact myself or my colleagues in Central and Northern California. There's a lot of complexities here. We're happy to answer questions on any of these, on any of the concepts in level 2. Jeremy, have we got any questions that we can quickly answer?
I've got one here so far that you can answer. Came from earlier in the webinar.
Okay.
Have you heard of anything since the release of the draft amendment regarding stormwater entering infiltration areas having to meet MCLs?
No. This is one of the complexities of this concept of detention and retention, is that while there's a large program on the part of cities and counties as part of their municipal stormwater program in retaining and infiltrating stormwater, and as I mentioned before, there's going to be a major emphasis on this as part of the updated permit, which is going to give you a lot of latitude to implement these detention, retention solutions when you are exceeding the TNALs. Remember that under the state concept of waters of the state, groundwater is a water of the state. you are not allowed to simply divert industrial contamination from stormwater into groundwater. And the problem is that if you are discharging to land in California, if there's a potential threat to groundwater quality, you are subject to a potential permitting process. And this has not been well recognized or really very well understood at the city and county level. And it's a challenge as the state tries to encourage these infiltration, detention, retention options. And I think as the commenter is reflecting on the indication that unless you are achieving drinking water, MCLs are essentially drinking water standards, that the state has suggested that unless your stormwater is clean as drinking water, you may have a permit obligation if you're going to discharge it, into the ground through some type of infiltration. Now, it is true that although people are surprised at this, that drinking water, some of the stormwater NALs are actually below the MCL drinking water standards, and this is particularly true for metals because there are some aspects of aquatic toxicity for metals that drives the very low NALs that don't actually drive, the human toxicity doesn't drive very low MCL. So it's possible to have something that you can't discharge in stormwater, but is clean enough to drink. It's an odd concept, but it is possible. But I guess in direct response, I haven't heard anything updated on that. And, this is going to be a major challenge because, if we're directing industrial stormwater towards groundwater, small amounts of contamination could result in a potential permit requirement. So this is one of the challenges we think that the board is really entering a kind of a massive difficulty around this whole subject.
That's all I got for you, Jeff.
Okay. Again, you can always email questions to, there's a quick survey at the end of the webinar here. You can add some questions there, or just shoot one of the York Stormwater practitioners. Be happy to answer questions within reason.
All right. Thanks for joining us, everybody.